Today we discuss the carbon tax with an expert from Ecofiscal. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. Today we're joined by Brendan Frank. Thanks for coming on. And before we even get into things, why don't we start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you so much for having me. So I have worked at the Ecofiscal Commission for about 3 years. It's an independent panel of economists from across the country who thought that the national dialogue over environmental issues was lacking. And so what we really look at is how we can use markets and market forces and prices to achieve better environmental and economic outcomes. And carbon pricing is just one of many things that we look at, although it has become a bit of a calling card for us.
So right now, just set the stage. Our goal is to have a discussion about the carbon tax and possibly dispel some myths that are floating on about it right now. So let's head right into it. The first thing I want to talk about is what exactly is the carbon tax?
So the carbon tax, or the carbon price, as you may have heard it called, is based on a really simple concept. If you litter or if you dump sludge into a river, you drive your truck down a highway, whatever it may be, you are creating pollution. The landscape is a little less beautiful, the water is a little less drinkable, the air is a little less breathable. But the problem historically has been that the costs of that pollution have been borne by someone other than the person creating it. So what a price on carbon does is it puts a price on the pollution that the polluter is creating. The atmosphere is free because no one owns the atmosphere. So it's a way to make polluters internalize the costs of that pollution. Global climate change is a huge collective action problem. No one person can solve it themselves. It's going to require everyone. And a carbon price is a very non-intrusive and sort of small government way of ensuring that everyone receives that signal.
Mm-hmm. And we're in agreement here. The interesting part that I find, though, is that this idea of carbon pricing or even carbon taxing, it's not necessarily a new form of policy. Can you talk about some of the history it's had in Canada?
Sure. Well, I mean, the history of putting a price on pollution goes way farther back than that. We can talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah, for sure. Touch on that.
So the first price on pollution was actually a cap and trade system, which is very similar. And it was actually developed in the United States as a solution to acid rain. I remember being on the playground as a kid and hearing acid rain was going to, eat your home or your bicycle.
Yeah.
So the U.S. actually created a market for it in the mid-90s. And acid rain in North America really isn't a problem anymore. Polluters had to buy permits for the right to pollute. And as a result, they found creative ways to get around paying for their pollution, which meant reducing the pollution, in this case, sulfur emissions that caused acid rain. Pricing in Canada is also not super new. The first system that arose was in British Columbia in 2008. They put a carbon tax of $10 a ton in place. And the tax has steadily risen over time. I believe it's now at $40 a ton. And what they did with the revenues was actually kind of novel, and it's become sort of a template for other nations. Mm-hmm. They used the revenues to cut corporate taxes and personal income taxes. So it was just a way of shifting the tax burden. The general idea is tax things you don't want, like pollution, and tax less of the things you do want, like jobs and income and growth.
Mm-hmm. That's really good, actually. And it even gives further incentive. You can view it like that. It gives them a reason to not want to pollute, not just that they're forced to by law, but there's also a monetary incentive because of things like these reduction in taxes. And we'll touch on it later, but the rebate's very interesting because households can profit from it, right?
There's definitely an opportunity for that, yes.
Mm-hmm. So since we're on this topic, actually, let's talk about in the context of the average Canadian, what are the biggest impacts that we can expect from the carbon pricing?
So it depends where you live. The general idea in Canada, which is a very large and decentralized federation, is that the provinces would take the lead on this. They would design their own systems. The federal government would set a minimum standard, in this case, a minimum carbon price. But it was really up to the provinces to design their own systems, whether they wanted a carbon tax or a cap and trade or a mixture of the two. It was up to them, and they could do what they want with the revenues. So right now, if you live in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, or New Brunswick, those provinces refused to design their own systems, and as a result, they have what is called the federal backstop, which is basically a federally designed system. The federal government applies the price, collects the revenues, and then returns it to the province it was collected from. And the idea there is to just to eliminate the possibility of transfers between provinces. So if you have a specific province that you want to discuss in mind, I'm happy to dig into that further.
Yeah, maybe Ontario, but actually, before we even get into that, this kind of raises a very interesting concept that I want to pick your brain about. So certain provinces, they actually objected to having this federal mandate on the minimum price of carbon. Do you think that's a fair criticism from their standpoint?
So this actually gets to an interesting concept. So there's a reason that economists prefer a price on carbon, and that is that it is the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. It's not the only way you can reduce emissions. You can design regulations, or you can hand out subsidies. Those are really your other two options. The problem with those is that it requires governments to make some decisions and anticipate where things are going. They might have to pick winners or decide that this industrial process is something we need to get rid of, etc. So the provinces that have declined to design their own systems are in fact relying on policies and programs that will actually cost their economies more.
That's true. And I feel like there's also another downside to what they're proposing. So let's say that there is no federally mandated minimum and the provinces can pick whatever price they want as that base. Certain places, as you're aware of, do not even want the carbon tax. So if they're given that power, what's to stop them from placing the price at 0.00001 penny per megaton or something like that, right? And other provinces who are taking it seriously, they may be disadvantaged competitively because they have a realistic price. Do you think that's also a possibility that could happen?
That's part of the challenge, yes. And that's sort of why there's a role for the federal government in coordinating that minimum price.
And I'm in agreement with you there. So we're also on the topic of the differences between provinces. One of those key differences is the rebate, the amount of money you can get. So not all provinces pollute equally, so the rebate fluctuates. Can you explain a little bit about what that rebate is and how Canadian families can take advantage of it?
Yeah, so a carbon price really is a two-step policy. So there's the actual price. So, gas, diesel, other fossil fuels become a little bit more expensive based on what the price is. But what gets lost in this discussion a lot of the time is that governments aren't setting the revenues on fire. The federal government, just because it has a lot of provinces to contend with, has designed a very simple and straightforward way to return the revenues. And what it's doing is issuing what you could call a rebate or a dividend. And it's based on family size. So in Ontario, for example, the average family of four will pay a little bit more than $200 in carbon costs this year, but they'll receive a little less than $300, or they have received a little less than $300 in rebates.
Yeah, and I find that very interesting. It was reported in the article you wrote, The Myths of Carbon Taxing, that itself gives a lot of incentive to families to get their pollution as low as possible, because you see right there, there's a potential for profit. If they can get their spending below even $200, it's just extra money into their pockets, right?
Yeah, there's an analogy that I've found pretty helpful for this. Imagine you go into a grocery store and you receive a $5 coupon for apple juice.
Yeah.
And when you get to the juice aisle, you see that the price of apple juice has gone up $4. You can still buy the apple juice, or if you prefer, you can switch to a different type of juice and pocket the difference.
Yeah, so there's so much incentive stacked up on the families. It's like kind of get going, stop polluting, and you can get some money from it. So it makes a lot of sense. There's some people.
And
yep.
So the thing I would add there, Marco, is that we're not doing this overnight, right? This is a long-term policy. It's designed for the long run. The carbon price right now is federally $20 a ton, which is just a fraction of where it would need to rise for Canada to meet its targets. But it's going to do that slowly, and people can make small incremental decisions over time. And, say when the time comes to buy your next car, you might opt for a more fuel efficient vehicle or an electric vehicle, as an example.
Yes.
Right? We're not doing this overnight.
Yeah, and that ties into my next question here is, do you feel like currently, like right now, obviously it's going to increase in the future, but right now, the carbon tax, do you think it's a little bit too small to drastically change consumer and industry behavior?
So I'll say right off the bat that at any price, there will be changes. It's just where those changes are occurring. The higher the price, the more changes we'll see. But at any level, there will be changes in behavior. There's good evidence from BC that there were small but measurable reductions in gasoline and diesel consumption, for instance. So yes, it is too low right now for us to hit our targets. But the idea is to ramp up slowly over time so that when it comes time to switch out your furnace or switch out your car or build a new factory, you'll take the costs of the pollution into consideration.
That's true. And I feel like this was actually the main criticism for the carbon tax. So this change, it may in fact vary greatly depending on location or your ability to adapt, let's say. So you have those rural communities who don't have access to things like good public transportation, which would alleviate some of their pollution in terms of driving cars. But you have those also who live in a place like Toronto, where they can change their habits quite easily. Do you think that's a fair criticism that people are saying, the way rural communities are overly burdened by the carbon tax?
So the challenges for urban and rural are different. Certainly, rural communities don't have access to as many public services. Some people don't have any choice but to drive. But the point, again, isn't to change this behavior overnight. It's to get people to start thinking about the costs of their pollution. And the federal system actually takes this into account. Rural communities actually receive a top-up on their rebate to account for those additional costs. Although there is literature to suggest that the difference that a rural community or someone living in a rural community and someone living inner city, the difference in their carbon costs is actually quite modest.
Yeah. It's very interesting to me, actually, because I feel like a key to really equalizing the playing field or addressing these differences is to build infrastructure, to get the systems in place that will enable people to have a greater range of choices. And that kind of ties into another thing I've seen. It's people are wondering if giving the rebates back to people in such plentiful quantities, is that really the best way to handle the money? Or would it be more ideal to take a little bit more of that and actually invest it into infrastructure that's going to help us in the long run handle these emissions?
It's a great question. And we actually think that that would be a productive place for the debate to move. You can look at different provinces that have decided to design their own carbon prices, and they've done plenty of different things with the revenues. Quebec, for instance, was planning on, although they've changed it since, but has initially planned to spend about 50% of the revenues from their carbon price on public transit. Alberta earmarked, before they repealed their carbon tax, about $1 billion in revenues for public transit. They were building a new C-train line in Calgary and a new C-train line in Edmonton. So it's really up to or the idea was that it would be up to provinces to decide what they wanted to do. So with in the federal government's case, making the what is being done with the revenues as visible and transparent as possible was the priority, and different governments will have different priorities.
Yeah, and transparency is always good. So from that stance, I definitely see it being a positive thing, at least for now. It's kind of a new thing in Ontario, for example. Giving the money back might allow them to ease into it a little bit more smoothly.
And that's kind of the idea, right? We're not where we need to be, but we should start now.
Perfect. And I kind of want to ask you a question about something that I've seen in the report. We kind of mentioned it before. BC introduced a carbon price in 2008, and it cited that had a major impact on the emissions, the reductions. I was wondering if we can actually account for how much impact it had, though, because in 2008, Canada actually entered a period of reduced greenhouse gas emissions per capita already nationwide. So do we know exactly how much the carbon tax had an impact in BC, or was it a case of a rising tide just raising all the ships?
Excellent question. Yeah. So the idea behind the literature on this is that you want to isolate for the impacts of a carbon tax, right? There are a million different things going on in the economy at any one point. So how do you tell? So there are good methods for doing this. I'm not sure how technical you want to get, but there are studies that can isolate for the effects of the carbon tax. They look at what would have happened without it, and then obviously they can figure out what happened with it. So there's a really good study. It's sort of the first of it. It was the first to look at the impacts of the carbon tax in BC, and it found that without BC's carbon tax, its emissions would have been anywhere from 5 to 15% higher than they were. And one thing you hear often about BC's carbon tax is that, well, emissions are flat, right? They've been flat for about a decade now.
Yeah.
But the economy has grown significantly in that time. So the carbon tax has helped to constrain the growth of its emissions, even in the presence of a growing economy.
And that's a really key point, actually, to recognize that even though the economy is growing, we've been able to constrain and keep it consistent. It's not like things are getting worse.
Yeah. So the way you can, the term for that is emissions intensity, right? It's how much pollution you produce per unit of GDP. And the carbon tax is very good at improving that ratio.
This also leads into my next question about how is the carbon tax different for big polluters versus just the average citizen?
Yeah. So this is where it gets a little hairy. There are actually two systems federally in Canada. One is the economy-wide levy, so that's the charge, diesel, natural gas, etc. And then there's a special group of companies who are what we call emissions intensive and trade exposed. And that's basically a fancy way of saying that they produce a lot of pollution and they compete in international markets. So a few examples of this are the cement industry, oil and gas, steel, really heavy industry that produce exports for global markets. And the point of this system is to prevent them from moving to another jurisdiction that doesn't price pollution, right?
Yes.
If you just apply a carbon tax indiscriminately without thinking about how companies will respond, you might end up losing economic activity and not doing anything to reduce pollution because they just move to another jurisdiction and do their thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of revolves around cost. And do you think passing off the cost onto the consumer is a valid concern?
Absolutely, it is. Certain companies will be able to do that better than others. But that's why the rebates, federally at least, are as generous as they are. If you incorporate both the direct costs, so what you pay for fuel, and the indirect costs, what companies pass on, about 70% of families still come out ahead. So there's been careful consideration there.
And now we get to a very interesting part, and it is, what are the alternatives to the carbon tax, and are there any?
Yeah, there are plenty. So as I said earlier, regulations and subsidies are really your other two options. So one example of a regulation that some of your listeners may have heard of is it's called a fuel standard. And basically what that is it requires fuel producers to gradually reduce the carbon content of the fuel that they provide. So, ethanol blends, biofuels, things like that. You mix those with gasoline or diesel, and as a result, it produces fewer emissions when you burn it. That policy is in place federally and in BC, or at least it was in BC, and it's been effective, but it's also been fairly costly. There's evidence from BC that they were selling those permits for about $185 a ton, which is significantly reducing emissions at a significantly higher cost than the carbon tax was, which was $20, $30, $40 a ton. The other option is subsidies, and you can give subsidies out for any number of things: home retrofits, business retrofits, electric vehicles, whatever the case may be. The problem with subsidies is that they require a source of revenue. So you either need to find a new source of revenue, run a deficit, or reallocate funding from elsewhere. And oftentimes you're actually just paying people to do what they would have done anyways, which is called the free rider problem, right? You might want an electric vehicle anyways to buy it, but you notice that the government is offering you a $5,000 subsidy, and you say to yourself, well, sure, I'll take that. Why not? So it doesn't actually, there are cases where subsidies don't actually reduce emissions. And we've actually done some research in Quebec that showed that their electric vehicle subsidy reduced emissions at a cost of about $400 a ton.
Okay, that's really cool, actually. And if we were to say, like, why the carbon tax over these other ones? I know you touched on them. Do you think it's fair to summarize it in saying the carbon tax is the cheapest way?
It's the cheapest way, certainly, but it's not always intuitive what that means. And one of the ways to think about it is that, people know themselves better than anyone else knows them. Businesses understand themselves better than government. So you really put the power and the decisions about how and where and when to reduce emissions in the hands of the individual with a price on carbon. And regulations and subsidies can't really do that.
And it makes me wonder, actually. So in the global context, how is the rest of the world doing when it comes to carbon?
So not great. There are somewhere between 40 and 50 carbon pricing systems around the world. So you have your usual candidates. The European Union has a price on carbon. Countries like Sweden and Finland have had carbon taxes for several decades now. China is currently working on developing a very, very large cap and trade system that will go live next year. So the architecture and the infrastructure is being put into place. It's just a question of, how fast can we crank the dial? Emissions are still rising quite quickly globally. So it's really a question of, how fast can we put those policies in place and crank the dials to where they need to be.
Yeah, and it really is key to think of it in the global context, because to really combat it, we have to be united. Like, a lot of different countries, they all contribute their piece. And if we're not all on the same page of trying to reduce that as close to zero as possible, then the problem will still exist.
Absolutely. It's a collective action problem, and it's a very, very challenging one. I would argue that there's, room and a strong rationale for Canada to lead on this front. We are a top 10 polluter in the world. We emit a lot of GHGs, greenhouse gases, per capita. And we also have one of the largest economies. So if we're not willing to do our share, why would smaller, less wealthy countries bother?
Yeah, exactly. Agreed there. And that kind of brings us to the end of this. But before we go, I just want to ask you one last question. Is there anything else you want to share? Maybe something that annoys you about the way carbon tax politics are currently being played? So
carbon pricing, climate change are both very high-profile issues right now. It's certainly going to be an election issue federally this fall. I think carbon pricing will be not the ballot question, but a ballot question. But at the same time, every political party in Canada has said that they take the issue of climate change seriously, and that they have or will have a plan to deal with it. So I would wonder, and I would hope that Canadians as well would ask themselves, why these parties are more interested in policies that are more expensive. It's a pretty much universally agreed upon idea among economists that carbon pricing is the way to go, and we don't see that political consensus yet. But I hope we're getting there.
Yeah, and that's a great way to end off the show. I think everyone should be sure to check out Ecofiscal. They put out some great reports, and really, you can learn a lot from them. So thanks for joining us, Brendan. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. See ya.